welcome to those of you who've joined dead on 2 o'clock. Thanks very much. And we know that people always join in the next few minutes, so we'll just give them a couple of minutes. I'm Ruth Cook from Action Learning Associates. I'll say more to introduce myself and Nick later on. But can I check with those of you who are here? Can you hear me okay? Could you reply in the chat screen if you can hear okay, just so we know? Great, thank you very much, Lucy, Kimberly, Jane. All right, we know it's working. Thank you to all of you who've replied, and some names that I recognise, so that's great. We've got an opening poll just to find out a bit more about who's here. So if you could complete that while we're just waiting for a couple of minutes till other people arrive. There's the welcome poll up on your screen. And there are actually 3 questions, so if you can answer all 3 questions, that would be helpful. Welcome to those of you who've just joined, and while we wait for a few other people, could you please complete the welcome poll that's up on your screen? There's 3 questions to answer. Thanks very much to those of you who've answered the welcome poll. Hi to those people I know, and those of you who are joining us for the first time. It's great to have you all here with us. We'll just give it 1 more minute and then we'll get started. Donna, you can't see the welcome poll. I'm just going to ask Becky or Klaus if they can answer you. Hope we can sort that out. Oh, that's because it's now closed. Okay, thank you. And we at least have a feel of those people who are here and how much experience they have. So that's great. Thank you very much. So welcome again. I'm Ruth Cook. I'm the founder of Action Learning Associates, and I'm very pleased to be here. I'll just tell you a bit about Action Learning Associates for those of you who are new to us. We were formed 23 years ago. So we've always done international and cross-cultural work, mostly in the NGO world, in the international NGO world, people like ActionAid and Oxfam, Amnesty and the Refugee Council, but also in the digital campaigning world and in the corporate sector. So we've done a big program for Heineken and more recently for a Scandinavian energy company and for a couple of beauty products companies, including Coty sales directors from different countries. We work in the WTO and the UN, and so and we've also done lots of work in the cultural sector in large international cross-cultural fellowships or in academic programs that are about social change. So I'm very pleased to have with me Nick Wright, and I've been working with him for the last few years on a program which is part of the Overseas Development Institute called ALNAP, and it's a global network of NGOs, academics, consultants learning how to improve the response to humanitarian crises. So we've been partnering with them to teach action learning to frontline workers, and Nick and I did that together and worked in 11 different countries. So it was a very interesting program. Nick is a psychological coach and an organizational development consultant, and he's worked for a number of international NGOs. So he's got 25 years of working, of leadership programs, and was worked in 14 different countries. So when he became freelance, I was very glad that he considered joining Action Learning Associates. And I'm going to hand over to him for the next 20 minutes or so, and then we'll make sure we have time for questions. There's just a couple of housekeeping things I need to share with you before I hand over to Nick. The team to support us today is Becky, who's managing our polls and will be sending out the emails, and Klaus, who is providing technical support. So if you need to contact either of them, please use the chat screen. If you've got some questions that arise for you as Nick is talking, please use the Q&A rather than the chat screen, and then that will enable us to look at the questions that are arising as we go along. The other bit of practical housekeeping is that everyone's going to have the recording sent to them, and it will also be loaded on the website. So now I'm handing over to you, Nick.
Right, thank you, Ruth, and thank you to all of you for joining us for this webinar. What I'm going to do now is I'll turn off my camera and bring up a PowerPoint presentation that we'll be able to see on screen, and hopefully you can still hear me. Okay, as Ruth has mentioned, the presentation part of this webinar should take about 20 minutes. Then there's opportunities for questions and answers afterwards. I want to start by saying just a bit about action learning. And then when I've done that, I'll say a bit more about action learning and culture and some of the cross-cultural issues that sometimes we encounter when doing action learning. And in our experience, some of the ways to address those things if and when they arise. And Ruth and I, we are open to hearing from you as well at the end, any insights and ideas you may have based on your own experiences of working cross-culturally to add to this conversation. Well, firstly, action learning itself. Some of you will already be familiar with action learning, and some of you may know different variations of action learning. But in essence, it's an opportunity for an individual to think through an issue that is real and important for them, and typically in a work-related context, in order to create solutions that work for them in that context. So it's a structured process, and it gives that person a chance to think something through more deeply and broadly in order to reach their own solutions. And typically an action learning process involves eliciting and exploring, that is posing questions to the person who's thinking through that issue, which is very different to teaching them or advising them on what to do. Action learning groups, they're a safe space that is normally have a facilitator that helps a group of people to work through that process. So at any point in time, one individual will be thinking through an issue and the others will be posing questions to help them to think through that issue for themselves in order to reach their own solutions and actions that follow from that. And the group will typically contract around things like confidentiality and also whatever they would need between them to create the possibility of open and real conversations around things that matter most to them. So a key skill in that is listening and exploring rather than debating. So where does this question of culture fit with action learning? With our experience, action learning can be a fantastic opportunity for people to think through issues in an open and honest way that maybe normally they would have very little opportunities to do. And that's partly because people self-edit when they're nervous about how people might respond to the questions or the issues that they have. Diversity of cultures within an action learning group can create great opportunities for fresh insight, and that can lead to new and innovative approaches to solving the issues that people face. And what is culture? Now, this is a complex question, and one of the best definitions that I've heard of culture is by someone called Edgar Schein, He's an organization development consultant. And he talks about culture as a shared pattern of beliefs, values, and behaviors. Now, the notion of shared there is really important because that'd be quite different to just individual preference or individual behavior. And if, for example, you noticed me in a group being quiet, and I was the only person in the group from the UK, if you didn't know the UK, you could think, wow, people from the UK are all really quiet. But it may be just that I have an introverted preference or maybe other things preoccupying me. If, however, you notice in the group people from the same cultural background being very quiet when it comes to this process of posing questions, it could be, although may not be, an indication of a cultural behavior that's being played out there. So, for instance, in some cultures, people would find it presumptuous to interject with questions unless they were directly invited to do so. In which case, in an action learning group, you may want to invite individuals directly to offer questions rather than waiting for them to jump in uninvited. Now, at the core of action learning, then is this idea of posing questions to someone, and also for the person who's thinking through those issues to invite questions and to receive those questions. And it takes place in a small group. So an action learning group, or set as it's sometimes called, will typically have between 5 to 8 people. And at the end of that process of posing and receiving questions, the idea is that a person then decides on their own actions. And these are the actions that they will take, having had a chance to think that issue through. You may want to just pause for a moment. If you have a pen and paper or something to write on, you might want to think about those core ideas in action learning and what happens in action learning. So posing and receiving questions in a small group with a view to an individual person deciding their own actions. What issues do you think that could raise in different cultural or cross-cultural groups? And by cross-cultural, it could be a group of people who are from different cultural backgrounds in the same group. And I just want to give you a moment to jot anything down that you think those core processes or core ideas in action learning could create. Now, by the time we get to the end of the presentation, if some of the issues and questions you've jotted down there haven't been addressed, there'll be opportunity, as Ruth said, to jot them down in the Q&A. And you should see a link at the bottom of your screen, Q&A, where you can pose any questions or experiences that you've had with action learning that could help to add to this conversation. We'll now look at each of these 3 areas in turn, starting with questions. So, in some cultures, posing short, direct questions can sound blunt, harsh, or rude. For example, I was working with a group of people, and one of the members in the group was from Myanmar, and he found this idea of posing short, direct questions, which are typical in action learning, to help a person to think something through. He said he would want to introduce that with something like, thank you for this opportunity to pose a question. I have faced some similar issues in my own work, and I would like to pose you a question with a view to helping you to think this through for yourself. Now, in the UK, we may say, well, you don't need to say all that because it's clear what we're here to do. But what he said was, in his context, to simply pose questions without that introduction could come across as damaging to the relationship or disrespectful of the relationship. Now, often in action learning groups, the people who take part are typically managers or leaders. And in some cultures, the manager may believe for themselves that they should have all the correct answers. They would say, the reason I've been appointed as a manager is because I'm an expert, I have more experience than others. And so if the managers ask questions, typically it's because they believe they are the ones who should have the answers to those questions to then help enlighten others. And others in a group may also expect that of managers, that they should have the correct answers when posed with questions. I worked in a group in Singapore, and the leader of the group there was a leader with other people in that group. When he was asked questions in the group, and it was in the context of action learning, so we had contracted around this, but when he had the experience of receiving questions, he said he felt as if his expertise was being questioned, and he felt as if that was undermining his authority in that group. And sometimes I've noticed as well, feeling type questions, which are sometimes posed in action learning, can be regarded as too personal. So for instance, if a person's thinking through an issue and somebody in the group asks, so how are you feeling about this? I worked with a group in Malaysia and they said that type of question is far too personal, because a person would only talk about their feelings normally in a personal conversation around personal issues. If it's at work, it sounded unprofessional. Second area, working in small groups. Now, in some cultures, if you pose questions to an authority figure, it can feel as if you're being disrespectful to that person, as if you shouldn't really be questioning them. And authority is a really interesting one in action learning. Sometimes when we develop action learning groups, we invite people who are peers, that is, in similar roles and levels of authority in different organizations. So we're thinking of it in terms of structural hierarchy. But when you're working with cross-cultural groups or groups from different cultures, sometimes questions of authority are not only related to hierarchy, they could also be related to things such as age or gender or nationality. An example was I once did some work in Uganda with an action learning group. And they were thinking through some issues together, and they had what to me, it struck me as a really insightful conversation with great questions. And they were creating what sounded like from the outside great solutions. And I was an external person from the UK facilitating this. And there was a question occurred to me as I was listening to the conversation. And I said to them something like, yeah, something that came to mind for me was this. I wondered how that might be. And immediately everyone in the group dropped everything they'd just been talking about and agreed with me. And there was nothing I could do to backtrack from that. So when I discussed with them afterwards what had happened there, they said, well, they believed the respectful thing to do to me as a guest, and they saw me as coming from head office, was to show deference by agreeing with me rather than staying with their own ideas. Some questions can feel inappropriate in an open forum. As an example, there was a woman from Taiwan, and she was invited to talk about strengths that she'd shown or deployed in a particular piece of work she was working on, so that she could draw on those strengths in the future. So it's a kind of question, what are your strengths? What are you good at? What did you do well? And she went completely silent. And when people tried framing the question differently, she stayed silent. So I asked her, is there something about the question that feels difficult to respond to in the group? And she said, yes. She said to speak about her strengths in this way, in her cultural context, would feel incredibly immodest. So to talk about herself in that way would feel inappropriate. Third dimension, actions. So I've mentioned that at the end of an action learning process, a person is invited to choose their own actions. So what will they do, having now thought through this issue? And I've noticed that in some cultures, people will show deference. That again is respect for authority by appearing to choose an action. So I worked with a group in Vietnam, and people would work through the process as we facilitate it. They go through the different steps of thinking through an issue, at the end coming to an action. And then at the following meeting, there's opportunity to feedback on what they did. And I noticed a pattern that very rarely did they actually follow through on the actions which they said they would do. Now, from a Western context, we could say that just means that people are being perhaps dishonest when they're choosing actions, or they're being unrealistic. But what this group said to me is, I said to them, what are the chances of you actually acting on the things that you've identified as action points? What are the chances of those things happening in practice? And they said, very remote. And they just laughed. And I said, oh, so tell me about that. And they said, we see you as a person who's in authority because you are the facilitator. The process itself has its own authority because it's intended to lead towards an action. Therefore, what seems to be the most respectful thing for us to do is to sign up to an action, whether we actually want or plan to do it or not. So they're giving respect to a facilitator guiding a process and to the process itself. and trying to be respectful in doing that, even though they were signing up to actions overtly, which actually made no sense for them. So something to be careful of. Decision making without a line manager can feel disrespectful. So again, in Myanmar, one participant at the end said he felt very uncomfortable about choosing an action that he would then take and report back onto a group without first discussing that with his line manager. And again, that was showing respect to his line manager. A person may similarly feel uncomfortable to make a decision unilaterally. I was working with a group in the Philippines. One of the people was thinking through career decisions. When it came to the action point, again, they became really uncomfortable and they said, this isn't a decision that they can take unilaterally. In their cultural background, it's a decision which needs to be taken together with a family, and particularly with parents and grandparents. So pushing for actions can prove challenging. So some ideas for solutions. So firstly, when you're working with groups of people from different cultures to your own, and maybe different cultures to each other, then you can check out your assumptions. You say, this is something I'm noticing. Help me to make sense of this. And inquire if you don't know. Ruth gave an example of someone who was in the group she was working with. And she said this person looked really bored. And she wasn't sure if the person was really bored or if there was something about a kind of a form of cross-cultural communication was taking place. And when she asked the group, they said, it's okay, this person really is bored. They were a group from the same cultural context. And so if there are things we're not sure about, we can ask. And don't feel too awkward to ask. That can be part of a contract for the group, that when we don't know, we will ask in order to help us to understand. So I will ask a group, so what would make this work in your context? What could be some of the challenges that we might face in doing this? And then how might we need to change the process? How can we tweak it so it would work well in your context? And a note of caution here is that different people from the same context, that could be the same organization or the same team or the same national context, they may come from really different cultural backgrounds. You may also have different people in the same cultural background that simply have different personal preferences. So something we're trying to discern at times as facilitators is what is essentially an individual preference and what could be a broader cultural phenomenon, both of which we need to pay attention to in working with the group. Further ideas for solutions. Build relationships. In Action Learning Associates, when we work with Action Learning sets, we'll always start by creating opportunity to get to know and understand each other first. I was working with a group in Somalia, and we talked with them about the action learning process that we plan to use with them. And they said, it's really important to us, we should have a chance to get to know it, understand each other first before we jump into that task. And when we did meet together in the first meeting, we spent the opening part of that conversation talking with me and each other about their own family backgrounds. And having had a chance to talk about their families, it's as if it positioned them in a human relational context, which allowed them to understand each other better, but it also built trust as we then continue to work together using action learning. I've already said something about perceived authority and the norms that people may use in different contexts. Also allow for variations, as I've given the example of introducing questions with what you might regard as relational preamble, if that's something that would work well in that culture, rather than just jumping into short and direct questions. Some final ideas for solutions here. Co-create experimental solutions. I will say to the group, this is how action learning might work normally. Let's have a conversation about what could be tricky in the cultural context the participants are involved in, and then what it would take to make it work, or what would work well for them. And examples here are, if it's difficult to pose and receive questions in a group, for some of the reasons of deference and authority and such I've mentioned, one group, so we could just give each other, we could write down questions and give them to the person who's thinking through an issue, and they could choose which of those to respond to. And it gave them choice, but without feeling exposed to a range of questions and needing to answer them in the group. In the group I mentioned where they would feel uncomfortable to create actions without discussing with the line manager first, they simply decided at the end of the process, they would have ideas which they would then leave, discuss with their line manager, and come back at the following meeting And having discussed it with the line manager, then they would agree on actions. And that felt respectful to the line manager, but it also meant they were likely to have the authority to pursue what they wanted to do. Reframing questions can be a really useful. If you notice a person getting stuck, the woman I mentioned from Taiwan who said she was unable to respond to questions around her own strengths and weaknesses, I asked her how we might frame this differently in order to explore some of the things that could make a difference. And as we talked about that, it became clear that if I said to her, if I invited you to leave the room at this point and invited some of your colleagues to join us, what might they say about you that would indicate the things which you are really good at and that you contribute well? When we framed it like that, she was able to then talk about her strengths because she was speaking about them from a third party perspective rather than from her own. Finally, contracting. In action learning, contracting simply means agreeing between us what are we going to do and how will we do it. And in our experience, it can be really useful, as with all action learning groups, but particularly with those where there are different cultural backgrounds. Contract how we'll do this from the beginning and review it en route. And sometimes it's really practical things, not the more kind of esoteric cultural questions. The final example I'd share is there was one group I was working with where one of the participants was from Jordan. And I said it'd be really useful if we could have our cameras turned on as we spoke together. It was an online group, and she had her camera turned off. So I asked her, is there a difficulty, for instance, with the internet connection in the context she was working in? It was a disaster zone. I assumed wrongly it was an issue of connectivity. And she said, no, it's nothing to do with connectivity. So I said, well, it can be useful to meet face-to-face in the group so we can kind of see and connect with each other at the start. Is there anything that would help you to meet face-to-face if that's something you're willing to do? And she said, to be honest, I can't turn on my camera at the moment because when I came to work this morning, I'm not wearing a headscarf and I don't want to be seen on screen by you as a man not wearing a headscarf. So if we could pause the group for 5 minutes, I can run home, I'll grab a headscarf, come back, and then I can turn the camera on. And it was a really simple, practical solution to something which otherwise could have felt a bit stuck. So that is the end of the presentation. I hope you found some of those ideas, as well as some of the questions that have been posed, stimulating. I'm now going to close down the slides and hand back to Ruth, who will now host a session of questions and answers and any insights that you would like to share with us. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nick. Oh, that was really, really fascinating. Thank you. Really interesting and stimulating. We only have a couple of questions in the Q&A, so can I encourage you to put some more in there? And I think there's a really interesting comment from Kate that's come that we could also be talking about neurodiversity here, that's something that as a facilitator you need to be taking into account. So yeah, thank you, Kate, for raising that. And meanwhile, though it's not directly related to working across cultures, as we haven't got any others at the moment, I'm going to talked about Isaac's question, which Nick may not have seen yet, but if you've got a chance to look at that as well. Isaac's asking about open space technology and whether you can use action learning within it when you break into small groups. And it's an interesting thought. I guess I would say, Isaac, that we always think of action learning as a group of people where there's some continuity and continuing over a period of time. But it's possible that you could use an action learning approach within the small spaces, that you could say to people, focus on one person's question or one person's challenge at a time and ask them questions rather than going straight into discussion or advocacy mode. So I think that's an interesting suggestion. And if you try it out, you can let us know how you get on, Isaac. Thank you. Lucy's asking, when someone's in a minority within the group, how do you address cultural privilege and or dominance? Nick, do you have any comments about that?
Yeah, Lucy, I think that's a really good and important question. in my experience, it means that when we are working with an action learning group, particularly when a group is being formed, that we need to give particular attention to any issues of privilege and dominance that could be within that group when we think of a different composition of participants in the group. And sometimes what we'll do is we'll meet with an individual to ask them, given who else is in the group, and it's particularly given issues of perceived status and privilege and such in the group, what would they need from us, from each other, from the way that group works, that means they're able to contribute the best and also to take their best from it. So it would be a conversation with the individuals in the group to make sure that they don't inadvertently find themselves marginalized in the group, which can then reinforce some of the issues which they're already facing. I know, Ruth, this is something that ALA, Action Learning Associates, has also been looking at recently. Is there anything you'd want to add to that?
No, I think that's a really, really good answer, Nick, and to allow it to surface and in a safe way as the facilitator. Yeah. Okay, there's lots of questions flowing in now. Kate's asking, what do we do if there's someone who's not aware of their own cultural prejudice and therefore might offend within a set? Yeah, that's certainly happened in my experience. Nick may want to add to this answer, but I think you create a safe space in an action learning set that means things can surface that wouldn't normally surface in a group and be addressed in a positive way. So I can think of things around gender or race where someone has kind of wanted to test out their thinking. But that's slightly different as from what you're asking about, Case. This is somebody who's being offensive and doesn't realize that they're being offensive. Kate, Nick, have you had that experience?
Yeah, again, it's a really interesting one, because I think in action learning, it's a bit like in coaching, that when you're contracting with a group, so partly it's about what is the purpose of the group, so what are we here to do, and to have that conversation really explicitly with the group, because you may find different people have different intentions in that or different assumptions around it, and also how shall we do it. And it's one of those things, I think, in relation to a safe space, I'd be asking the groups, what do you need from me, from each other, maybe from yourselves, to make this a safe enough space for you to pose questions and also receive questions in a way that's kind of useful for you and it serves that broader purpose of the group well. But I would also invite the group to think about what would make this challenging enough for you to stimulate real possibility of change and change and new solutions. And often people will say, do you know, I would invite feedback as part of the review of the process as we go along. I would love to know, how am I coming across? Are the things that I'm saying which are not landing the way I might hope they would be? Because that's part of my own learning journey. So I think that whole question of how we contract with a group so it's safe enough and challenging enough, both together, can be a really powerful way to address some of those issues.
Mm-hmm. Annie's asking about how you get to know people not just in their work context. So we often use an exercise around origins and influences and what matters to you that some of you who've trained with us as facilitators will be familiar with. And whether there are any other ones that work well cross-culturally. I just throw in, I know when I was working in a number of African countries where Nick and I were working on the ODI program, it was quite hard to get people to talk beyond giving their CV. That's what they assumed you meant by introducing yourself. So we had to work hard at making sure it wasn't just about them at work, and specifically asking them to talk about themselves outside of work or their family. Any other ways that you've used, Nick, to get people to kind of open up in that intro session, which is so important for creating the trust?
Yeah, thank you. Again, the example I mentioned previously about a group in Somalia was an example where what I said to them is, this is an opportunity to know and understand each other better. because we're wanting to bring together questions from a range of different perspectives that help the person to think this through, perhaps in new ways. And in doing this, we're bringing ourselves as whole people, not just the perspective we might hold in work. And I invited them to share something with each other that others in the group don't already know about them, because these already had some existing relationships. And they chose to talk about their families. And it became this conversation around, they were all men, and they were all talking about how many wives they had and how many children they had, and what that was like for them, and how they balanced life and, you know, family and work and all these different things together. That's the way that they chose to answer that question. I've worked with some groups as well where you can choose a metaphor. Some of you may have heard of River of Life. River of Life is an activity that's often used in cultures where storytelling is a common part of that culture. And you can invite people to imagine maybe the last year, or it could be their whole life, whichever time frame you want to choose, and to imagine that's something like a river. And just as a river may have narrow points where the water moves quickly, or broad places where the water maybe is more calm and smooth, and there could be waterfalls where the water's crashing over an edge, there could be rocks in a river, where the water's now having to meander around it, there could be crocodiles in the river, whatever. And it's invite people to share something of their own life experience or their own work experience for that period, and to depict it as a graphic. So to draw that, and on that graphic to depict things which for them have been really meaningful or really significant. And what they will then do is hold up that picture and share that with the group. And every group that I've used that with, they found it a really powerful way of understanding not just what's happened in each other's lives, but also what for them really matters. And that question of what really matters points to things like values, which can be then really used when it comes to the action learning process more broadly.
Thanks, Nick. I think you've introduced something there which reminds me that the use of images can really, really help rather than language in terms of people introducing themselves. And I think it's the most powerful one that I've ever participated in. And it was a group of people, and it was Action Aid many years ago, and we were working on transforming it from being a child sponsorship to an organization that dealt with the causes of poverty. So it was a fantastic piece of work. And the intro exercise was for them to draw what they thought about a world without poverty, what that meant to them personally, a world without poverty. And I can picture them now, even though it was, I don't know how many years ago, I mean, decades ago, but it was just so powerful because it went kind of beyond language to get people to do an image. Yeah. We've got some other interesting questions. Okay, so Claire asks about cultures closer to the UK, and said and she meant closer geographically, and that sparked me into thinking about working with a French organisation where actually the differences were huge, and we worked with two beauty companies that I won't name, but who were merging, and one was French and one was English. And there was a lot in understanding each other, the cultural differences, and using action learning as a way of exploring those and learning from each other. So geographical closeness might not be an indicator of anything. Actually, we have worked in Sweden and Denmark. So I think we have to be careful about your assumptions about any culture. I also did a lot of work in Australia, and that was a really interesting discussion to have about, what are the defining characteristics of your culture? Help me understand it better, and that gave me a lot of insights. So yeah, superficially, you might think there's a lot of similarities, and then we explored them.
I was just thinking, if anyone watches Netflix, there's a series on Netflix, Emily in Paris, that some of you may have seen, and it's a satirical view of somebody from the United States who arrives in Paris to work with a marketing firm there, and all the things that happens to her cross-culturally. So it's a kind of satirical play on cross-cultural things that can happen so easily, working on all kinds of different assumptions. So that's quite an entertaining view of such questions.
Yeah. What about John's question about, John's saying that oh, yeah, that brevity in the UK, brevity can indicate credibility, and people will state their point of view and then justify it. Whereas in a Latin context, people will tend to provide the rationale first and build up to their point of view or their conclusion. And I think it is challenging for a number of cultures, including the UK, for people to just ask a question and not give a rationale for their question and not give a sort of big paragraph. So we really work and encourage people to just ask a simple question. And I think there are cultural challenges around that in lots of different places. Nick, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to say sometimes it's not. So yeah, we sometimes talk about high context cultures and low context cultures. And high context is where somebody would give a lot of the background to a perspective or a position they are holding. And a low context culture is where people may just say how they see it, just very briefly. And in some cultures I've worked with, such as in the Philippines, for instance, if that is a high context culture, if that background isn't expressed, it can feel as if something's being withheld, and it can undermine that sense of relational connection and trust. So sometimes it's about giving sufficient opportunity for people to express those things, that kind of wider frame, so it gives sufficient trust to be able to then address some of the deeper questions more honestly. So it's a tricky one to manage. It also creates, if you're a facilitator, it can create issues around time, because if everybody's framing all of the questions with that wider background context, it takes more time than just very simple, short questions. Yeah. And if you're working cross-culturally, if a person's giving too much background, maybe a bit like I'm doing now, it can distract the person who's trying to think something through from what they're trying to think through. So I sometimes describe it to the group. If you imagine a person who's thinking something through, they're on a journey. They're already thinking that thing through, and all you're wanting to do is to give them nudges that might help them on their own journey. And if we say too much, it can become a distraction from that journey rather than something that facilitates their movement.
Thank you. There's a really interesting question from Yuri. Good to see you, Yuri, where some approaches to action learning, such as that practiced by YL and in South Korea, state that they can't follow traditional action learning due to cultural contexts. Do we agree? And I know Nick's got more experience of working in Asia than I have and can respond. I have very limited experience, and one was I was working with the UNHCR, and I was asked within a big training program that they were working on, which was all about safety, to introduce action learning, and it included a lot of Japanese people. So they were just having a taster experience of action learning. They'd never done anything like it before, and I was very nervous about whether it would work. And they loved it. I have to say, we had the same experience when we worked in Nissan in Sunderland, and it was because action learning was seen as a problem-solving tool. So if it was seen as that, and I obviously think action learning can be far more than that, but if it was seen as a problem-solving tool, then it was very acceptable. Nick, you've got a lot more experience of working in Asia than I have.
Yeah, so I haven't worked in Korea, but I have worked in a number of other countries in Southeast Asia in particular. And yeah, when I've used action learning, it's a bit like if you use coaching, it's needing to have a conversation with the people who are engaging in that process around what are the limitations in the approach that we would typically use, if like in more of a Western context, and how could it be adapted in such a way that would work and would be useful for them in their context. And sometimes that is the questions we've looked at around hierarchy, perceived hierarchy, authority around decision making, questions around to what degree can an individual unilaterally make their own decisions, especially around major significant challenges in an organization or their own personal life. Because the cultures I've worked with in Asia have typically been far more collective in nature rather than individual. So an example which wasn't in Southeast Asia, it was in Uganda. There was a group wanting to think through an issue, and they said, we can't relate to your individual way of approaching these things. It's very alien for us. So we looked at how we might do it differently. And what they did was they said, okay, so let's think between us, what is the issue we are facing? So then they had a conversation on what's the issue we are facing rather than individual. And then they had a conversation around, and what are the questions that if we were to ask ourselves these questions would help us to address this? They then had a conversation about what questions they might ask themselves as a group. They then posed those questions and decided what might we do now, having had opportunity to consider these questions together. And they agreed between them what they would do. And to me, that was an amazing example of taking an action learning methodology, but applying it to a group rather than simply to an individual. So the group, in a sense, represented what in the Western context might be an individual. And I thought they did that brilliantly. So that's an adaptation that worked well in that context.
Now, I'm conscious that it's 45 minutes that we've been online, and some of you may have to go. I'm going to suggest that we overrun by 5 minutes, but ask that, and just to address a couple more of these questions, but I'm going to ask Becky if you can put the closing poll up at the same time so that those people who have to leave could complete it before they leave. That would be great. Thank you. So there's a question from Ryan, which is simple to answer. Does a cross-cultural group require a more robust contracting stage? Answer: yes, they do. I think that's clear from what Nick said, that you might have to pay a lot more attention to that. And linked to that is Lucy's question: when someone is in a minority within the group, and no, there was another one about no, it was Sonali's question. If you've got a cross-cultural action learning set, does the balance of participants from one country to another matter? Nick, what do you think about that?
I was still thinking for a moment about the question about the robustness of contracting.
Right, okay.
Can I just quickly say something in response to that
Please
question?
do. Yeah.
I think that's a really important question around the contracting, and the contracting can prove just as tricky as the action learning process itself because of some of the dynamics we just talked about. And so sometimes if you're contracting with an action learning group with people from different cultural backgrounds, you need to do pre-contracting with the individuals first.
Yes.
Find out for that individual what would make this work for them, what might they need from themselves, each other, maybe others outside of that group, in order for this to work well with them. And then what support might they need within the group to have that conversation around contracting. If you do that with the individuals, you can then have a conversation with the group around, so what does this now point towards in terms of what we will do and how we will do it? So that would be very different to the way I would normally approach that with, say, a group in the UK.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And the balance of participants, yes, I think it's not just about culture. It might also be about the power dynamic that underlies culture, and you would need to look at, I mean, Nick's already mentioned you've got somebody from headquarters or someone from the funding organization or the funding country, and that will have an impact on the action learning set. Okay, Clive's, this is an interesting approach of using action learning where the person takes away their responses and then comes back. Yes, I've participated in a set like that, and it was an interesting process. I wanted to try it out, and yeah, I think there are questions around confidentiality if you're emailing questions or if you're emailing responses, and there's also something about having time limits to it. So we worked in a very disciplined way of people could pose questions and then people could answer them in a certain time frame, so that you put some sort of boundary around it in the same way as you would with an action learning set that's meeting in time. But it's, yeah, it's complex to manage it and to manage it safely. Okay, one last question. Marta's asking about closed questions, and in some cultures, there might be more of a tendency to ask closed questions. Any thoughts on that? Asks Marta. Nick?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. In different parts of the action learning process, different types of questions can be useful. And if we think of it pragmatically in terms of what's useful rather than a rule around which kind of questions you can ask. So for instance, if a person says, this is an issue I'd like to think through, and somebody asks them, so when you mentioned this person's name, is that your line manager? It's a closed question, but it's helping the person who's wanting to ask further questions to help. It's giving them the information they need to understand enough to be able to do that. So the beginning part of action learning, closed questions, can be useful just to kind of check, like fact check. If people are used to posing more closed questions, action learning gives them an opportunity to experiment with posing more open questions, because that may feel less natural for them. And we can also provide guidance if you're the facilitator on how they might do that. And what we might do is, if somebody poses what sounds like a closed question, we could invite them to have another go. How might you frame that if it was a more open question? And if they get stuck, other people in the group could also suggest alternative framings as open questions. So it models an approach of open questions. Something I've also done with a group that got stuck, they just couldn't see the point of this, to be honest. We had a conversation about what can be the benefits of open questions and what we meant by that, as distinct from more closed questions. And when they teased that out between them, it's like something clicked, and then we're willing to have a go at learning to pose more open questions because they could see the benefits.
Thank you very much. I realise that we haven't answered all of the questions there, but there have been some really interesting ones. Thank you. Thank you very much, Nick. That's been really, really helpful. As you can see, we've got a closing poll. We'd really like to know whether you're interested in training as an action learning facilitator or using it with in your organisations, and we'd like to know what you thought of our session today. So please complete that. Nick and I are about to leave now, but we're going to leave the poll open so that you can complete it before we go. But thank you very much for joining in the discussion. It has felt really positive. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you to all of you as well from me. And just to say that Action Learning Associates does run training for action learning facilitators. So if that's something you'd be interested in, do have a look at the Action Learning website as well, where there's further opportunities to do this in practice. Thank you.
Thanks very much.